So my name is Ken Fero, and I'm part of Migrant Media, which is a film activist collective.
How long have you been a filmmaker?
From about the mid-80s, mid-1980s, that's when Migrant Media started to get together. We were basically working in our own communities, doing activism and also trying to be making films as well. And basically what happened was that people would come like from television, from broadcasts, and they'd want to do a story about, which has had something to do with migration or refugees, and they would almost use us to get into the community and then do their story and get out. And we thought to ourselves, no, this won't work anymore. So we decided to like come together and form our own collective. So we would have support each other and have power of being a collective. And also because every single story was always negative. It was always about exploitation. That goes on, of course, but the other side of it is the resistance. And we were all about the fight back, because in every community, whenever there's injustice, there's always people that resist. And that's what we wanted to do. So, yeah.
So looking back when you first started, you started in fine arts producing experimental films to now. When would you say that police brutality came on your radar as something that you wanted to pursue?
Well, that's me as an individual, and obviously people change. The art stuff was something I enjoyed, but I've got a social conscience, and I couldn't really exist in the art world knowing that everything outside was just a complete mess. And also I had my own experience as an immigrant coming to Britain and the area that I was in, the people I went to school with, and the reality on the streets of South London at that time in the 70s and 80s. I mean, it was great. It was rough, but it was great. But you can't close your eyes to what's happening around you, So me, that's my individual decision to use film politically, not just for the sake of art. And everyone in migrant media comes from different backgrounds, whether they're second generation Caribbean or whether they're refugees or whatever. We all kind of share that experience of migration or being other. And so, and also the way people live. When I grew up on the estates we grew up, everyone was like, it was all about class, and there was a strong unity there. And so that's important.
So in the first few moments of your film Injustice, you tell the story of
Shiji Lapite,
who died in police custody, and you show the traumatic scenes of the protest thereafter.
Yeah.
And the screams of his wife in complete despair.
They beat him to death, they killed him. Why should they kill? Why? 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 Why?
Does it shock you when people deny that death in police custody still exists in the UK or does exist in the UK?
It doesn't shock me. It disappoints me. It doesn't shock me in a sense because it's really not covered by the media, or hasn't been until the past couple of years. Before the George Floyd case, it was very hard for anyone to actually, outside the community, because people within the Black community, the migrant community, they know about these deaths, they know about these killings. It's nothing new, but it's about how that message gets out to the wider population. So I can't blame people for being ignorant of the facts, but I can say that once you know those facts, if you don't do anything about it, then you become complicit. And so I think people know that they don't want to know that they know. It's that kind of thing, and people from every community come up with excuses all the time. Well, they were just doing this or they were doing that, for them to be in contact with the police anyway in the first place, they must have done something. And that's the narrative the police put out after a death. It's okay, this person was doing this, they were doing this. And the victim becomes blamed. The victim becomes the person who's done something wrong. And, the victim in the eyes of the media deserved to die. And that's very clear when you look at a case of Joy Gardner in terms of the way they depicted her. I mean, she was a mother, a student, and she was studying media actually at Guildhall, and you know, they depicted her as a monster. They had to depict her in that way because they had to find a way to try and justify why she was killed in her own house at 5:30 in the morning in front of her 5-year-old son, because there is no justification for brutality, you know? There is no justification for that brutality. And so they bring out these tropes, this racist tropes all the time about Black people being strong and big and violent. And it goes back 200 years, you know? Well, people know about it and people have to just come to terms with it. I mean, I went to school with Brian Douglas, who's in the film, who's in Injustice. And, you know, we were in the same school, in the same classes and everything. And I know the reason that he's dead is because he's Black. I mean, not everybody has that closeness to what's been happening. So I think the whole issue of race and class is something that people are not really talking about. They're talking about issues around representation, getting more Black representation, for example, in education. That's all good. That has to happen. But representation won't make any difference to people being killed by the police. But that's another argument. But yeah, by that film, Injustice, we made, because, as I said before, we were out there and we were documenting things, and people just called us and they said, you need to come to the station now. And the film is a very simple chronology of what we did, which is, because we made a film about Joy Gardner before that called Justice for Joy. So obviously we knew about the issue in a lot of depth and a lot of detail. And we just decided, okay, let's go for this, because nobody had been talking about it. There'd been very few films made by BBC and Channel 4. The cases were only covered as criminal cases. So there was nothing about the families, there was nothing about the community, there was nothing about the patterns. Why is it that we've had like over 1,000 deaths? What is it? Why are these people being killed? Nobody had done that. No organization, not the BBC, no newspaper had counted the number of people being killed. Now that figure going around, people use that all the time. But when we made the film, nobody had actually counted. How can you say you have an independent media when the very basic journalistic elements of figures and facts are just completely ignored for decades? It's shocking. But that's part of why people don't know, because the work hasn't been done. Enough work hasn't been done on this issue.
How long did it take you to film that?
Took 7 years.
Wow.
5 years to film, and it took us 2 years to edit. And it wasn't supported by Channel 4, BBC or anybody. We did it off our own back. So we were living, yeah, it wasn't great how we were living, but the work we were doing was great, because what we did is that we decided to just put everything into it. And to be honest with you, if somebody had told us it had taken us 7 years and what we went through, I don't know, we would have done it anyway, I guess. But yeah, we just did it, and we had to do it because nobody was supporting the families. And what we did with Injustice, because, you know, is people talk about political filmmaking. I mean, we make political films, but we also make films politically, meaning how we make the films is working with people, you know, very, very closely. So we worked with the families very, very closely, and we got involved in the campaigning and the struggles for justice. And we helped to build the United Families and Friends campaign, which was a coalition of all the family campaigns. And that political work is hard. It's hard to do. It takes a lot, you know, you have to do it day in, day out, year after year. But it's worth it in the end, because you're creating something radical and new, and you're unifying people, putting people together, which you can do when you're a filmmaker, because you're free to go around. If you're on the 9 to 5, what can you do? You can't really do anything, you know? You're stuck. So we took the freedom that we gave ourselves to share with the rest of the world what was happening under their own noses and in their names. And so that's what Injustice is about, really. But yeah, the two things, the filming and the activism and the politics, they're just like this. They've got to be strongly together.
Who do you think should be the people that are kind of bringing this to light? Like, do you think that the media is not doing enough? Do you think the police are kind of should be a bit more attentive to this subject? Do you think that people should just be a bit more woke? Like, where does the responsibility lie?
I think the responsibility lies across a lot of levels. It lies within the education system, because people are not taught about these things. It lies in terms of within the state. and the state you can break up into, obviously you have police officers who kill, and I'm talking about cases of murder and manslaughter, and then other cases which are around lesser charges, but people are still dying. But if you look at those cases, we have the officers that commit the crime. Then you have the officers who make excuses for their colleagues. Then you have the investigating system, whether it's the IPCC, which we see in Injustice, or the IOPC, which replaced it and is current now. So that's the police, state investigating itself. Then it's the Crown Prosecution Service who make a decision on the basis of the evidence which the IOPC have done in terms of the investigation of the crime, of the incident. Yeah, the Crown Prosecution Service then have to decide whether it's in the public interest to prosecute the police. And sometimes they decide it's not in the public interest to hear the truth. And the CPS obviously, it's the Crown Prosecution Service, so that represents the monarchy and the government. So across the whole state, you have every single layer is fighting against the family for truth, for justice. Then the other side, as you mentioned, it's the media. Stability is really important in this issue. And for example, when we made Injustice, the police tried to get it banned, and it became really well known. There was a big kind of public profile for the film, and we offered the film to Channel 4 to show. 20 years later, they're still refusing to show the film. We firmly believe that if Channel 4 or the BBC, who we offered the film to as well, had shown Injustice, and if people had seen this film and have felt what people feel when they see this film, there would have been a big push for change, because you can't deny the truth in the film, and you can't deny the humanity and the pain and the anger. It's all in there. And I think if people had watched it, if it had been broadcast, there would have been change. If change is about political will, and everybody, the barristers and solicitors and the groups that work with the families, we have murder charges in this country. We have manslaughter. We don't need any more laws. We don't need to make any changes. We just need to implement the laws. And the only thing that's stopping these laws getting implemented and more police officers being prosecuted and being convicted is there's no political will. And political will only comes through when the people move. It's the power of the people that changes the minds of government. If Marcus Rashford decides to do something about school dinners, then it gets changed, And so that shows you, just with one person who uses their celebrity in a really positive way, how it's possible to change the national situation. So I think, that's part of the problem, is that the media have colluded in this. And I can give you lots of examples of meetings with Channel 4 when we were making the film, where they've absolutely denied that this is an issue, denied that it's worth covering, and said there was no value in the stories. And that's within Channel 4 at the time. This is when we were making the film. So, you have to ask yourself why that is. And it's because obviously when the state says we're going to look at this issue, then everybody jumps up. And this is what's happened recently. Because of Black Lives Matter, suddenly, all of a sudden, every company and every organization was saying, yeah, we need to deal with this. We need to deal with this. They had to deal with it. They had to do that, not because they suddenly became, politically conscious. They did it because they saw thousands and thousands and thousands of kids on the street saying, we're not going to take it anymore. They had to respond to that. But really, when you look at their response, it's very little and too late. And it's not systemic, and it's not going to deal with the fundamental issues of deaths in police custody, which we call police killings. Because even in the language that's used in this country, death in police custody, what does that mean? It's actually a killing by the police. So we have to use this language, because at the moment, it's all about fighting a battle for hearts and minds of people, to convince people. And you can't use soft language like deaths in police custody. You have to use the truth, which is a police killing. So it's complex, but how to put it simply, I think people know what's going on in this country, and they have to make a decision where they're going to allow it to happen in their name, or whether they're going to try and stop it. And if they want to try and stop it, I would just say to all everybody to get on the streets, to support the kids that are on the streets now that are protesting, because you can see in this country, there's been a big change in the last few years. Young people are really much more militant than they've been in a long time. And that is an amazing kind of thing. And there's a lot of people who really want to do something about it and who are thirsting for the knowledge and want to know how to change things. And they're doing it. And it's not just around racism, it's around environment, it's around the Me Too movement, all of these things. So I think the world is changing for the better through these generations. And that's what gives me hope after 40 years doing this.
Yeah. But it feels like, wow, I can't believe this, because you went through so many years of just kind of the same thing and the denialism to now it's completely changing on its head.
It's good, yeah.
So like when I was looking at the Brian Douglas story, it was the second story in the Injustice film. One thing that struck me is the level of investigating that the families did off their own backs. As a result of the police officers' response not actually matching to the reality of the situation. Yeah. And then I've actually done interviews with myself where I've seen that, families have had pictures of, some of the scenes, and there's footage of some of the acts, and yet the same situation continues to happen. So they gather evidence and they're doing their own investigations because they're not happy with the outcome. Yeah. So like, in your experience, have you seen this as being a common occurrence in the families doing the work of the investigation themselves when they actually should be mourning?
Yes, 100%. I mean, you've outlined it really well, and it's very common because what tends to happen is that from the first time the family hear about the death, when the police knock on the door, they're lied to, they're controlled, and after a certain amount of time, they kind of start seeing things in front of them, like the body, and they're told, well, this happened, they died of a heart attack or whatever. And when they have an autopsy, an independent autopsy, they find out that the person is very heavily bruised. They've got bruises to the head. They're prevented from seeing the body sometimes. That happened to the Sean Rigg case. They demanded to go behind the screen. And when they went behind the screen, they saw the bruising on Sean. And that's the families forcing themselves into the situation where they can actually do what the police, what the state is meant to be doing. The families don't want to do this. They would much rather justice comes through the proper mechanisms. But because justice is not there, and because there's attempts to cover up, and this is all evidence-based, this is not just my opinion, this is all through evidence over years and years and years of cases, the families are forced to do that because they need answers, they need justice. And the state is not offering answers and it's not offering justice. So they have to take it on themselves. And usually they do an amazing job, forensic job. They do a proper legal investigation, much better than some of the people who are employed by the state to do it. And so what they do is they do it and then they give it to the state or they give it to the CPS and they kind of force them. And there's been case after case after case, like the Douglas family, like the Rigg family, like Leon Patterson's family, Janet Alder, I can go on and on and on. There's been over 2,000 deaths in police custody. And so that's 2,000 lost lives, 2,000 families, many of whom had to do the investigation themselves. And even if they don't investigate, they ask hard questions. They have to keep pushing. They have to, because when you look at the fact that we've had only one successful prosecution over the past 40 years out of 2,000 cases, there's a serious issue there. So yeah, the families do have to do the investigation, and they do and we made a film with the Rigg family called Who Polices the Police, where we follow the investigation. And what we do in our films is that we follow the investigation and we present it, because the evidence that comes up in the investigation by the family is so compelling, it's so strong, it goes completely against what the state presents. I mean, you mentioned the Brian Douglas case. That was an inquest. It didn't even go to trial. And the inquest verdict was misadventure. The inquest jury were brought in from Eltham in South London, which is the place where Stephen Lawrence, a black teenager, was murdered. why would you bring a jury from an area which is known to be racist for an inquest for a man from Clapham, which is a completely different area of South London? The police officers in that case said the baton slipped up, and so it didn't get any further than an inquest verdict of misadventure. But the family had 3 QCs, 3 Queen's Counsels, look at the evidence that had been gathered. And the QC said, one of them said this is a murder case, and 2 said it was a manslaughter case. How can you have such a disparity between an independent QC looking at the evidence that says it's murder, and then the state that say it's a misadventure? And misadventure is basically saying Brian deserved to die. And that case is one of the strongest in terms of evidence, because there's so many witnesses and there's so much forensic evidence. It's just amazing that the state have got along with it for so long. But, you know, all these cases, the evidence is there for all these cases. And I think one of the issues at the moment in terms of what's happening with BLM and the awareness in terms of policing and racism is that people assume that the families want things to get better, and they do. But they're not doing that because they want to improve the situation only. They want justice for these cases from before. And whether it's 10 years or 20 years or 30 years ago, these cases still need to be dealt with. And that's what the families are doing and will be doing over the next year, you know, because it's not just about improving the system, which is the job of the state. It's about getting justice for these cases. And in America, we know that there are cases that are going back 30, 40, 50 years being reopened now because the political will is there. So some people might think this is over, they've got away with it, but they haven't, you know, because if the will is there, if people demand it, you know, and I would ask people to demand it, if they demand justice, if they believe in justice, if they want to support the families, if they believe in truth, they should listen to the families and what the families want, because it's them. They're the ones who should determine where this goes. It shouldn't be done by activists or filmmakers or politicians or newspaper writers. It should be done by the families. They're the ones that know it, and they're the ones that feel it, and they're the ones that should be listened to. And that's what we try to do with the films, to give the family a voice, or not give them a voice, but to frame the voice so that people have to listen to them.
What kind of pushback did you get from Injustice being aired? I know you kind of touched on it a bit before when you spoke about Channel 4 and BBC. But like, did you kind of get any responses from police officers that didn't want the film to be aired?
Well, it's a long story and you don't have a lot of time. But I'll shorten it. Basically, we made the film. We made films for Channel 4 before, and then we said, okay, we're making this film about police custody. And they said, no, we're not interested. We're not doing it. So we said, okay, we'll make it ourselves. And really, that doesn't happen in this country, because people that work for television, it's a financial and a legal relationship. You know what you can and can't say, and because of that relationship between the broadcast media, and to a certain extent between the police and the broadcast media, because they do work very closely together. You'll notice on British television, a lot of cop shows, following police officers around. That's business. That is business. And so getting, and for newspaper journalists, you know, getting inside information about crime is something they rely on. So there's a business relationship between the police and between media, broadcast media and print media. And so when somebody comes along and says, we're not interested in that relationship, we're interested in something else, which is what we did when we made the film, it's pushing. Yeah. And also in the film, we had the evidence that these were crimes, police crimes of murder and manslaughter, and we presented that evidence. For us, the film was about human rights abuses and the right to life. And for us, the right to life was more important than the law of libel. Because, you know, the law of libel is something which is important when you publish. You can't libel somebody. But for us, because we had the evidence, and the right to life was for us the most important issue, we published what the families were saying, and the police were shocked that we put the film out, because we hadn't consulted them. Even though we had written to them to ask them to take part, they refused to be part of the film. But in any case, you know, the film was about the families, the voices of the families. So when we published, we were about to release the film at the Metro Cinema on the 6th of July. So this is around 20 years ago from the time of this interview. Two police officers who were in the film threatened the cinema with legal action. They said, if you show this film, we're going to sue you. That was the Metro Cinema in Central London. Of course, the cinema had to do what they had to do to save the cinema because they didn't want to lose the cinema. But what we did when we made the film, for the first time, we started calling police, death in police custody cases, we started calling them police killings, and we started calling them human rights abuses. Now, this was in 2001, so that's before the Human Rights Act and all the kind of the framework that we have today around the human rights abuses. So people said, hold on, these people are making a film, they're calling police murderers, they're calling them human rights abuses. These people must be out of their mind. They probably thought we were completely insane. But actually, if you look at the film, it's very, very simple. It's just full of truth. But because we framed it around human rights abuses, and actually one of the influences that we had because we knew when Malcolm X went to the United Nations to talk about the situation of Black people in the USA, he said himself, you know, it's pointless talking about civil rights when you don't even have human rights. What's the point of having civil rights if you're being killed? And so we thought, well, you know, he was right about that. So let's not talk about improving the system or about, you know, this is just being around racism. This is about human rights abuses. And we invited to the screening all the families who are in the film, plus the ambassadors of many countries like Britain accused of human rights abuses, Iran, Cuba, Vietnam, China, and they came. The ambassadors came, and they came because the global picture of Britain is not the picture of Britain that people in this country have. Many countries know Britain as a colonial, imperialist, warmongering nation, and that's their experience, you know? And so we had all the ambassadors and all the families who, for the first time, were going to see a film which was their voice. And when it was pulled, obviously, it just went crazy, and we ended up on BBC television and then on CNN, and the police started sending out letters to all the cinemas we had it booked, and every cinema would cancel the screening. And the police were accusing the cinemas of promoting a film which was libelous and also was an incitement to riot. So they said that basically if the film was shown, it would incite riot, and that the police officers shouldn't be accused of the crimes they're being accused. And this went on and on for months and months, us running up and down the country. And every time a screening was cancelled, and it was cancelled, somebody in the audience would get up and say, I'm a school teacher, or I run this place, or I run a pub, and the film would be shown that night, the same night it would be shown. And the police got the message that they couldn't kill the film. They tried to kill injustice, and they couldn't kill it. And then finally, we went up to the police officers who were in the film, who were accused of murder and manslaughter. We showed them the film, and we told them that if they didn't stop harassing the cinemas, that we would take them to court for loss of earnings because they were preventing the film being seen. And after we did that, they stopped all the threats. So officers who were accused of murder and manslaughter decided, together with the government, together with their advisors, that they wouldn't stop the film being shown anymore. So what does that tell you? If you're accused of murder and manslaughter, wouldn't you push it all the way? Wouldn't you want to clear your name? And so that's the situation we were in there. And then eventually the film was shown all over the world. It was shown broadcast in lots of countries. It had screenings. It was in lots of festivals. So it's been very kind of successful in that terms. And also politically, it made a huge difference at the time with the family cases and the investigation. So it had a huge impact. But you can't see that film on Channel 4 or BBC still to this day. It's banned. Sorry, that was a long answer.
No, it was a great answer. Can you tell me about Ultraviolence?
So Ultraviolence, when we made Injustice, we thought that it could change things in this country. We hoped that because migrant media is a very small group of people, 5, 6, 7 of us, we took on the police and we actually won. There aren't many broadcasters or filmmakers that can do what we did, but we did it because we had no choice, because we were in it with the families. And when you believe in something, when you believe in truth, you know, nothing can stop you. Then we looked at the material and we said, oh, there's another film here. There's a follow-up to Injustice. And Ultraviolence really takes off where Injustice left off. I mean, Injustice was about the present. It was about what was happening at the time. Ultraviolence is about the past, because we investigate cases again, and it has the same power in terms of the families in it, but also it looks at the victories that have been in the past. It looks at the 60s, it looks at that big movement, the Black liberation movement, the anti-imperialist movement, the anti-war movement, because we made the film in 2005, 2006, so the Iraq War was on. And also the Janet Alder and the Paul Coker case, which are the two main cases in the film, they were happening. And there are connections there between war at home and war abroad. And some people may say, well, why is he saying a war? But to some people on the streets, it is a war. You know, it is a war. And that's the reality of people. You can't ignore it. You can't play it down. You have to present it from their point of view. So anyway, so the film is about resistance in these two areas of internationalism and policing. And also it's a bit different because it's written as a letter to our children, talking to them about really the failures of, I would say, our generation, and telling them that, you know, there is hope, and if you fight, you will get somewhere. And that's what the film tries to do. It tries to give hope, and it's come out at the perfect time, because what's in the film is what BLM, the Me Too movement, and everybody else who wants to change the world needs to kind of, you know, needs to listen to. It should give people hope, because it is possible to change things. It is possible.
When we spoke briefly on the phone before the interview about 2 weeks ago, I think, you told me that you were having issues with the police not wanting to air Ultraviolence.
Right.
Like, is this still happening, and will it still be aired, or is it going to be like, are they going to try and prevent that?
We haven't had any issues yet with the police. That was, I mean, with Injustice, obviously, we had a lot of issues. And I mean, I didn't, you know, we also had death threats, and we had all kinds of things happening all the time. People would phone up and say, oh, you know, I used to work for MI5 or MI6, and now I'm in, I don't know, in Sweden. We think what you're doing is really good. You have to keep pushing, but just be careful, you know, just be careful, like when you take your kids to school in the morning, or check your car underneath your car. So we had all these spooks. And we had obviously threats from the police and everything else. So we don't really talk about that, because it's a bit distracting from the deaths, really, and that's our main focus. But yeah, people should know that, you know, we do have these things in this country, that people are threatened, and filmmakers are censored, and there is freedom of speech, but it's not, you know, unlimited. There's freedom of speech if you say the right thing. And so, you know, but yeah, but in terms of Ultraviolence, we have to wait and see what the reaction of the police is going to be. We just have to wait and see, and we'll know on the 26th of June at this launch what the situation is going to be.
It's going to be launched at the BFI.
Yeah, it's had one screening at the London Film Festival, which was, you know, it was, for us, that was really prestigious, because after being excluded, ignored, laughed at for years and years and years, for it to be actually recognized is, you know, it I don't know, it's a vindication. And yeah, and like I said before, you know, it's when you get told by so many people for so long, you're wrong, you're wrong, you're wrong, you know, you get told that all the time, you're wrong, why are you doing this, it's not that bad, it's not an issue. If everybody around is telling you that, but you know in yourself, because you live it, you work with people who live in it, you know what the truth is. It's very, very frustrating to be, you know, excluded, and to be denied, and to be shut down. So it's good that our Ultraviolence now is receiving the kind of attention it is. And it's only good, obviously, because it'll bring the attention to the families, which is what we want. It's not about the film. For us, film is just a tool, you know, it's a weapon. It can be used or it can be not used. The families involved in the film and even the families from before are all ready to move with it. There's a plan to organise a People's Tribunal on police killings in 2022, and Ultraviolence is going to kick that off. And so we'll have to see what happens. But, you know, I would say to people, watch the film and get involved. Countries have changed because 4 or 5 people have got together. So don't feel ever that nothing can change. You know, don't think just because TV is full of negativity that things can't change. Just because it's not on the television or not on the newspaper or not online or not on social media. You know, believe in what you believe in and support others that need your support.
It was so nice to speak with you. You've been doing some great work, so I have to thank you. Like, I was watching the film, as I said before, and it really just hit me in my heart.
That's the power of sound and image, you know. It cuts through all the, you know, we don't need any more reports. We don't need the Silver report. We don't need the Angelina report. We don't need all these reports. We just need powerful films.